The morning of my graduation ceremony, my mother called me at 6:47 a.m. to tell me she wasn't coming, not because she was sick, not because there was an emergency. She said, and I remember every word because I wrote them down the second I hung up, "Honey, your brother has a job interview this afternoon and I need to be there for him. You understand, you always land on your feet." I stood in my apartment bathroom, holding my phone against my chest for a long time after that. The cap and gown were hanging on the back of my door. I'd spent 3.5 years finishing a degree I'd started twice, working nights at a hotel front desk, eating a lot of peanut butter and crackers, and waking up some mornings genuinely unsure if I had enough in me to keep going. And my mother wasn't coming because my brother had a job interview. My brother, for context, was 31 years old and had been having job interviews, according to my mother, on and off for about 9 years. I sat down on the edge of my bathtub and I thought about calling someone. Then I thought about who I would call. My father had been out of the picture since I was 11. My roommate was already at her own family's brunch. The person I most wanted to talk to was my grandmother, and she had passed the previous November, which was honestly the reason I had pushed so hard to finish in time for the spring ceremony in the first place. She had asked me to walk across that stage. She had made me promise. I said out loud to no one, "Okay, fine." That was the beginning of the day that changed everything. I should back up. I grew up in a medium-sized city in Ohio, the kind of place where everybody knows roughly what your family is worth, and nobody says it directly. My mother came from what she liked to call a good family, which in practice meant her parents had owned a hardware store and her brother had become a dentist. She carried herself like someone who had almost had more, and that almost never fully left her. My brother, Fletcher, was 4 years older than me and had my mother's coloring and my mother's confidence and my mother's complete and total attention from the day he was born. I don't say that to be dramatic. There are photographs of Fletcher's first birthday party that involved a rented bounce house and a custom cake shaped like a fire truck. I know this because the photographs are still in the living room of the house I grew up in, framed. My first birthday photograph is me in a high chair with some cake on my face. I don't know where that photograph lives. I've never been asked. Fletcher was the one who was going to do big things. That was just the family understanding. He was smart, my mother always said. He just hadn't found his path yet. While he was finding his path, he lived at home until he was 26, at which point he moved into an apartment that my mother helped furnish and whose rent she quietly supplemented for at least 2 years. I know this because I accidentally saw her bank statement once when I was visiting and helped her troubleshoot something on her laptop. I was not the one doing big things, I was the one who was fine. Capable, my mother sometimes said, but without the warmth she used when she said smart about Fletcher. I got decent grades, stayed out of trouble, got a partial scholarship to a state school, dropped out after 1 year when the money ran out and I couldn't make it work, spent 2 years waitressing and saving, and went back. I did this quietly. I did not ask my mother for money because by the time I understood I could have asked, I also understood the answer would have been complicated and the debt would have been emotional. My grandmother knew all of this. She was my mother's mother, which you might think would make her loyalties complicated, but my grandmother was one of those people who simply called things what they were. She used to say, "Your mother loves you the way she knows how, and the way she knows how has some gaps in it." She wasn't cruel about it. She just didn't pretend. She came to every school play. She drove 4 hours round trip to see me walk at my community college transfer ceremony. She sent me $20 every birthday in an envelope with a card she had picked out specifically. Never one of those generic ones, always something she had clearly stood in the card aisle and chosen. After she died, I found out she had left me a small amount of money. Not life-changing, but real. Enough to matter. Enough that I understood she had been thinking of me even when she couldn't show it in the ways I needed most. I had wanted, more than almost anything, for her to see me graduate. She didn't make it by 5 months, so I was going to walk anyway. I was going to walk because I told her I would, and because the degree was real, and because I had earned it in a way that felt earned in my actual body, not just on paper. And I was going to walk alone, apparently, because my mother had better things to do. What I did not know at 6:52 in the morning on the day of my graduation was that someone else had already made plans. Her name was Deb. She was 73 years old, a retired high school English teacher, and she lived in the apartment directly below mine. We had become friends in the way you become friends with a neighbor when you're both early risers, and you keep running into each other at the mailboxes, and eventually one of you says, "Do you want some of this coffee? I made too much." That had been Deb, offering the coffee, about 8 months before graduation. She knew about my grandmother because I had told her when it happened. She had knocked on my door that evening with a foil-covered plate of roasted chicken and said, "You shouldn't be alone with takeout tonight." I hadn't even told her I was planning to order takeout. She just knew. Deb had 3 adult children of her own who were scattered across the country and visited her twice a year if she was lucky. She never complained about this in a way that asked for pity. She just mentioned it the way you mention weather, matter-of-factly. Like, it was a condition of the world she had accepted. We had talked about my graduation once, about 2 months before. I had mentioned offhandedly that I was nervous about the ceremony, about sitting there in that sea of people who all seemed to have brought half their family while I wasn't sure who I'd have in the stands. She had looked at me over her coffee cup and said, "Well, when is it?" I told her the date. She nodded like she was filing it away. I forgot about the conversation, or I told myself I'd forgotten about it, which is probably more accurate. At 7:15 on the morning of my graduation, there was a knock at my door. I opened it and Deb was standing there in a navy blazer I had never seen before, holding a small paper bag from the bakery 3 blocks over. "You're going to want to eat something before," she said. "And before you say anything, I already cleared my whole day. Don't make it weird." I stood there for a second. "You bought a blazer," I said. "I had a blazer," she said. "I had it cleaned." I started crying in my doorway at 7:15 in the morning, and she handed me a napkin from the paper bag and said, "All right, that's enough of that, we have a schedule," and walked past me into my kitchen to make more coffee. The ceremony was held in the university's main arena. 1,200 graduates. Families packed into the tiered seating like it was a sold-out game, everyone waving little signs and craning their necks to find their person in the sea of identical caps and gowns. I had texted my mother that morning, just, "Ceremony starts at 10, just in case anything changes." She responded 3 hours later, after the ceremony had already started. The text said, "Hope it goes well, sweetheart. Take pictures." My brother texted me that afternoon. His message was, "Hey, heard you graduated, congrats, no punctuation, no capital letters." Autocorrect probably did the rest. I didn't respond to either of them right away. What I was thinking about, sitting in that row of metal folding chairs in my cap and gown, was the moment I walked into the arena and scanned the stands and saw Deb, already seated, already holding a handwritten sign she had clearly made herself, block letters on a piece of poster board that said, "DR." PH with a star drawn next to it. The DR was aspirational. My degree was a bachelor's, but the intention was so specifically and completely her that I pressed my hand against my sternum for a second just to keep myself together. She had also, I would later learn, introduced herself to the strangers sitting next to her as Paige's person, which was not a phrase she and I had ever used, but which landed somewhere in my chest and stayed there. The speaker that morning talked about resilience, about paths that don't go straight. I usually tune out commencement speeches, but this one caught me somewhere in the middle when he said, "The people who show up for you tell you who you are to them. Pay attention to who shows up." I thought about my mother, who had not shown up. I thought about Deb, with her cleaned blazer and her handmade sign. I thought about my grandmother, who had shown up every single time she possibly could, and who was not there because she had run out of time, not out of love. When they called my name and I crossed that stage and shook the dean's hand and turned to find the section I knew Deb was sitting in, she was standing up, clapping with her hands over her head like it was a stadium concert. The strangers next to her were clapping too, because she had apparently told them enough about me during the wait that they felt invested. I laughed, out loud, on the stage. The photographer caught it. That is the photo that lives on my refrigerator now. What happened after the ceremony is the part I did not fully plan for, though in some ways I had been preparing for it for years without realizing it. My mother called that evening. She had apparently heard from my aunt, her sister who I had texted a photo to, that the ceremony had happened and that there were pictures and that I looked happy. My mother's tone when she called was the particular tone she used when she felt she had been excluded from something, which was interesting given the circumstances. "You didn't even let me know how it went," she said. "You didn't come," I said. "I explained about Fletcher. I know what you explained." There was a pause. "I don't understand why you're making this into something," she said. And that was when something that had been loosening for a long time finally came all the way free. I want to be careful here, because I don't believe in performances of anger. I don't think the point of having a hard conversation is to make the other person feel as bad as you can. but there is a version of telling the truth that is not an attack, that is simply a clear-eyed accounting of what is real, and that is what I did. I told her I was not making it into something. I told her it was already something. I told her that I had spent the better part of a decade quietly absorbing the message that Fletcher's needs were urgent and mine were background, and that I had been patient with that because I understood she loved us both, but that I was 31 years old and I was done pretending it was fine. She said I was being ungrateful. I said I didn't think that word meant what she thought it meant. She said I had always been too sensitive. I said, Mom, I work full-time. I put myself through school twice. I did it without asking you for help, because I knew what asking you for help looked like. And today was the day I finished and you didn't come, because Fletcher had an interview. I'm not sensitive. I'm just finally saying it out loud. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I don't know why you have to make everything about you. And I said, I'm going to go now, I love you, but I'm going to go. And I hung up. I sat in my apartment for a while after that. Deb had gone home hours earlier after dinner, after insisting on taking at least 40 photographs, after making me tell her 3 times what the dean had said when he handed me my diploma case. The apartment was quiet. My phone buzzed. Fletcher. Mom says you're being dramatic again. I put my phone face down on the coffee table and went to bed. Here is what I did not know that evening. I had been for the previous 2 years quietly building something. Not as revenge, exactly. At least that's not how I would have described it at the time. I would have described it as getting serious about my own life. But in retrospect, I understand that some of what motivated me was a decision I had made somewhere around the time my grandmother died, which was that I was finished waiting to be seen by people who had chosen not to look. During my second pass through school, I had worked on a project with a professor who was developing a nonprofit financial literacy program for first-generation college students. I had done good work, she had noticed. When I graduated, she asked if I wanted to come on full-time in a program manager role to help launch the thing properly. The salary was modest but real, and more importantly, the work was mine in a way that felt true. I said yes. 6 months after graduation, the program had its official public launch. There was a small event, a reception at a downtown venue, donors, board members, local press, a few city officials. My professor introduced me to the room as someone who had lived the problem we're trying to solve, which I had given her permission to say, and which still made me have to breathe carefully for a moment when she said it. I sent my mother an invitation. I sent Fletcher an invitation. I sent my aunt an invitation. I also put Deb's name on the guest list and called her personally, and she arrived wearing a different blazer, a burgundy one, and said she had had this one cleaned specifically. My mother came. She came, I think, because my aunt told her it was a real event with real people, and that there was going to be a mention in the local paper, and my mother cared about local papers more than she let on. She wore her good earrings. She brought Fletcher, who was wearing a blazer that still had a dry cleaning tag on the sleeve, and didn't notice, or didn't care. I watched them walk in. I was standing near the door, talking to one of our board members, a man named Arthur, who had built a regional HVAC company over 30 years and had opinions about financial literacy that were genuinely interesting. When I saw my mother and Fletcher come in, I excused myself and went to greet them. My mother looked around the room and then looked at me and said, "This is nice, honey." "Thank you," I said. "I'm glad you made it." Fletcher said, "Yeah, this is cool," and picked up a glass of sparkling water from a passing tray and immediately started looking at his phone. I stood with them for a few minutes. I introduced them to a couple of people. My mother was pleasant. She smiled at the right times. She said, "We're so proud of her," twice, using the word "we" in a way that I noticed but did not comment on. Then my professor gave her remarks, and she talked about the program, and she talked about the people who had made it possible, and she talked about me in a way that was specific and real and not generic, because she is not a person who does generic. She said I had started this project as a volunteer while finishing my own degree. She said I had brought something to the work that she couldn't have hired for, because it came from having actually lived it. She said she was proud to have me leading this into its next chapter. The room applauded. I looked at my mother. She was applauding too, and her face had an expression I had not seen before, something that wasn't quite pride and wasn't quite discomfort and might have been both at once, like someone doing math they hadn't expected to have to do. Fletcher had put his phone away. After the remarks, my mother found me near the dessert table. She put her hand on my arm and said, "You really did this." I said, "I really did." She said, "I didn't know." I waited. She said, "I didn't know it was like this, the job. What you'd been doing." And I thought about how to answer that. I thought about saying, "You didn't ask." I thought about saying, "I tried to tell you." I thought about saying a lot of things. What I said was, "It matters to me that you're here tonight," which was true, even as I understood what it had taken for it to happen, and what it had not taken, and what that said. My mother pressed her lips together and nodded, and for a moment she looked like she might say something real. Instead, she said, "You look beautiful tonight, by the way," and squeezed my arm and went to find the desserts. I don't know exactly what I expected. I think part of me had hoped for something more complete. Some version of her seeing what she had missed and the accounting being clean and whole. Life is not usually that clean. The people who have let you down don't usually hand you a fully finished apology tied with a bow. More often, they look at something you've built and their face does something complicated, and you understand that the recognition you needed years ago has arrived too late to be what you needed it to be, and you have to decide whether partial credit is worth something to you or not. I decided it was worth something. Not everything, but something. Fletcher called me the next week. This was unusual. Fletcher Stahl did not typically call me unless he needed something, and I braced for it. What he said was, "That thing you're doing, the financial literacy thing. Can you tell me more about it?" I paused. "Why?" I said. "I don't know," he said. I didn't realize what it was. Mom showed me the article. There was a piece that had run in the local paper 2 days after the event. A short one, but real. My name, the program's name, a quote from my professor about why this kind of work mattered. I had not sent the article to my mother. My aunt had forwarded it to her. "What do you want to know?" I asked Fletcher. "I don't know," he said again. "I guess, how did you figure out what to do? Like, how did you find it?" It was such a genuine question, delivered so flatly that I almost didn't recognize it as genuine. But I think it was. I think Fletcher, at 35, was sitting with something that had started to bother him, and for once was not outsourcing the discomfort to my mother's management. I talked to him for 40 minutes, about the program, about the work, about my professor, about what it was like to go back to school as an adult, and how much harder it was than I'd expected, and how the fact that it was harder had also, strangely, made it more mine. He listened in a way he had not, in my memory, listened to me before. At the end he said, "I think I kind of missed out on knowing you." I didn't say anything for a second. Then I said, "You still can." He said, yeah, I said. "It would just look different than it did before." He said, "Okay." We hung up. I don't know what that will become. I genuinely don't. Family is not a problem that gets solved. It's a condition that gets tended to, and sometimes you tend to it and it becomes something. And sometimes you tend to it and it doesn't, and you learn to make peace with the uncertainty. What I know is that I'm not waiting anymore. I'm not waiting to be seen, not waiting to be validated, not waiting for the people who were supposed to show up to finally show up. The people who show up tell you who you are to them. I know who I am to Deb, who has since told me I am the daughter she didn't get geographically, which she said so matter-of-factly over coffee one morning that I laughed until my eyes watered. I know who I was to my grandmother, who made me a promise and made me make her one back, and whose $20 birthday cards are still in a box in my closet, all of them, every single one. I know who I am to myself, which took longer to figure out than it should have, and which I am still figuring out, honestly, but which feels more solid under my feet than it ever has. The morning of my graduation, my mother called to tell me she wasn't coming, and I stood in my bathroom holding my phone and thought the day was going to be about loss. It wasn't. It turned out to be about something that had already been there, quiet and sturdy and patient, waiting for me to notice it. I noticed it. I'm not going to forget.